Hi everyone, this is Peter, and I'm just going to talk briefly today about a kind of phase of post-impressionism that I'm going to call in this lecture the expressive phase. This is to distinguish it from another variety of post-impressionism that probably be best described as the formal phase. The primary artists that I would look for a kind of a version, if you will, or people explored the formal side of painting, and we're going to focus primarily on painting, would be primarily these two artists, Georges Seurat and Paul Cézanne, who spent most of their careers developing the properties of paint, and in particular, as in the case of Seurat, looking for a quasi-scientific way to think about the effects that color have on perception. So we have the example with Seurat of his invention of the technique of pointillism and so-called optical mixing. If we look at Cézanne, Cézanne is certainly very interested in working with paint as a kind of intermediary between depth and surface. I think this is particularly easy to see if we look at the example in this slide. This the scene of Mulsanne Victoire, where the surface of the picture has been broken up into hundreds of small planes, each sort of defined by a brush stroke. It's not possible really to think of Mulsanne Victoire in terms of an illusionistic rendition, like a color photograph or something like that, but instead an opportunity to think about the ways in which these different patches of color intersect with each other. In many ways, both Seurat and his Sunday on the Grand Chat or Cézanne's Mulsanne Victoire, the subject matter might not be at the heart of the painting enterprise. I guess the best way of thinking about it. The paint itself and the way in which color and light intersect to create a picture for the viewer are probably closer to the heart of the mission for these two artists. When we look at what I describe as the expressive phase, and this is one of the great examples of that in action, we're looking at art and artists that seek to use light and color in very different ways. That is to say, they're not interested in that quasi-scientific, laws of physics kind of approach that we might ascribe to Seurat and his explorations of the behavior of color. We would not be thinking about the interest that an artist might have in just straight arrangement of color on a flat surface, as Cézanne appears to be doing in the Mulsanne Victoire. If we look at the art of Vincent Van Gogh as a kind of alternative to that approach, and in particular this piece called The Night Cafe, we have a kind of new direction in painting which casts aside a reliance on representations of, basically either local color, that is to say, the artist is not bound necessarily to depict colors the way that the eye typically receives them, is not necessarily bound by the behavior of light and color in any common physics sense of the term. And this is something I think that the idea of mixing colors and shadow and things like this that the Impressionists have really begun to pioneer. Van Gogh is not necessarily interested in that either. Instead, what he's concerned with is the expressive power of color, and it may even begin to veer off into a sort of arbitrary and completely expressive mode. To take an example of arbitrary color in the Night Cafe, we might look at the central figure standing adjacent to the pool table and note that his hair is bright green. Now, it's possible, I suppose, that like in stage lighting or something, that somebody's hair is going to be bright green, and I even occasionally have students that have bright green hair that's been, that state's been induced by dye or what have you. But you can see in this piece that really, I think that green hair has no business really being there. This is not typical of men in the later 19th century when this is painted. So this might be one small example where the artist is willing to basically discard the the typical natural local color. I'd suggest also the degree to which Van Gogh has created an oddly garish and brightly lit, highly contrasting kind of scene that is very, very uncommon, let's just say, for night cafes in general. Visitors of such places prefer things to be a little bit more on the dark side. And we see these lanterns, sort of pulsing and radiating in light, making this more akin to the proverbial detective interrogation chamber than a place where, one might, kind of chill and kick back. As indeed you can see on the left, somebody's trying to do that and probably not succeeding underneath the glare of these brilliant lights. One of the great things about Vincent van Gogh is that he went on at some length in a number of letters to his brother explaining his ideas and purpose in art. So a good example of this at work is where he describes, and it's great that we have this specific thing from the painting. He states in a letter to his brother, right, that he wanted the painting to convey an oppressive atmosphere. This is in southern France, where he moves. An oppressive atmosphere, a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime, to express the power of darkness in a low drinking spot, in an atmosphere like a devil's furnace. So he's not necessarily interested in saying, okay, I want to have a photographic representation of a barroom interior. In fact, I think quite the contrary. He wants to use color and light to express a kind of inner vision of what that, what that might look like if it was endowed with the kinds of qualities he's described. Again, a devil's furnace, a place where one could go insane. That's really not what the average bar interior looks like if you've ever been to one, but that's not what Vincent van Gogh's purpose is going to be. The same kind of thing is at work in one of his most well-known pieces, and that, of course, is Starry Night. And Starry Night is very much the same mode, with perhaps even more emphasis on that distinctive sort of signature brushwork that's very typical of especially later Van Gogh's. Here we have a landscape out across the town of Arles, which is a relatively small location in southern France. I shouldn't say actually Arles; it's near Arles. So looking out across a sort of awesome open series of rolling hills with a distinctive flame-like cypress, we're seeing a view of the heavens that is really quite unlike anything one is likely ever to see, at least hopefully, looking out a window in the evening. The sense of movement, the sense of this kind of torrential rolling river in the cosmos is the artist's own personal vision. And again, if we think about the ways in which the scene is really a vehicle for color and light, it makes a great deal more sense than a actual accurate depiction of the way in which astronomically speaking the world works. Again, we have that possibility of beginning to think about the artist's state of mind more accurately via his letters. Perhaps death, Van Gogh writes, is not the hardest thing in a painter's life. Looking at the stars always makes me dream as simply as I dream over black dots representing towns and villages on a map. So why shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots on the map of France? Just as we take the train to get to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to reach a star. Now, this isn't conclusive. It isn't, a definitive statement of the artist's purpose, but it gives us some insight into how he might be thinking about the subject that's being depicted here. That expressive aspect, which is so important, I think, to Vincent van Gogh, also finds expression in the painting of Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin, I think, simultaneously seeks a kind of internal psychological frontier, sort of mode of exploration, but one that in the end winds up being mirrored by his rejection of Western culture and eventual departure from Western Europe, seeking ever farther locations, eventually culminating in his voyage to the South Seas and Tahiti. So if we consider this painting, this is the painting, A Vision After the Sermon, Jacob Wrestling with the Angel of 1888. Here we see a group of local women from Brittany. So Brittany is far off in the west, northwest of France. It's on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, and is really not, at least in the artist's mind, anywhere near as sophisticated or quote unquote civilized as Paris, the Paris that Paul Gauguin came from before he decided to become an artist and get away essentially from, as I mentioned, civilization. So what's fascinating about this is that the women are all in a very peculiar position in 1888, and that is to say, so overcome with religious piety and feeling. They've just heard a Sunday sermon where we have this subject of Jacob wrestling the angel, an image that has a very long history in Western visual art, an image of religious doubt and struggle, and they're actually viewing this outside the church. And if you look at the piece itself, it's a very interesting sort of collection of shapes and colors that really don't correspond well with what an onlooker would have seen, perhaps, if it was sort of painted in a more straight, say, realist, again, think Courbet and the Bareillet Ornan, or even Impressionist kind of mode. So, for instance, the most striking feature, besides, of course, actually seeing an angel wrestling with Jacob, is the really strikingly brilliant red field that replaces what we might normally expect to be, grass. So it is an outdoor scene, theoretically a kind of landscape, but it's you can't see it that way because of that brilliant red. It has indeed the vision of a medieval manuscript, the inclination in regular visual experience to find forms that are, express depth or, perspective. All of that has pretty much been dispensed with. So Gauguin is certainly going in that direction. Now, as I've mentioned already, Gauguin ultimately seeks refuge from the West by heading far out into Polynesia and Tahiti. This is the kind of, we could argue, fantasy, conception that begins to emerge, particularly in the wake of the Romantic era, that we are best off closer to nature and far away from the corruption of civilization. Gauguin made a fairly substantial, especially given his poverty and ill health, substantial number of fascinating works that explored the visual forms of these Polynesian cultures. We'll think a little bit more going forward about the phenomenon of primitivism. But in this really quite epic and on a huge size painting entitled, it's in French in the upper left, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? It's very clear that he's interested primarily in the expressive power of these sort of aboriginal, if you will, shapes and forms and colors. In the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about symbolism